Hi, Dr. Dave Webster here. This is a short PowerPoint video I put together trying to talk about some key points about PET scanning or molecular imaging, of which PET really is the ultimate currently available technology to image metabolism in patients. Mostly we use radioactive sugar called FDG PET scanning, as we'll see. There's lots of information on the website, but on the internet about PET, and in particular I'll put a link onto AntMini, which is kind of an odd name for a website, but it's one of the preeminent websites in the world for access on information not just about PET, but diagnostic imaging things, techniques in general. And the latest on that, I don't believe there's any restriction. I think you just have to register, email and username, and you can get access to this information. Very critical site for the most current information on PET, for example. Anyways, I'm going to just do this short little video and talk about it. But as I've said, FDG PET scanning, it is the world standard of investigation and management of cancer patients, and has led to the era of personalized molecular medicine. And why is it personalized molecular medicine? Because we're allowed, what PET really allows us to do is image the metabolism of the patient's tumors and other tissues directly. The image you see there is the top of the patient, that's their neck, at the top of their arm sticking up, and there's lots of normal tissue there like the liver and so on, but there's some red lines there pointing to some very abnormal tissue structures, which is this fused image of a PET scan of an FDG PET image, one slice of it, and it's fused with a CT scan. And all PET scanning now basically is done where you have a PET scanner attached to the CT scanner. This is such an example here. That is the bed the patient lies on. This is the PET camera. The patient is wheeled in, or slides into the middle of this thing. Some people have issues with, as you might expect, with claustrophobia, unfortunately, but this is where the PET information is acquired, and here's the CT portion, which does that portion. Now, this is the images from such a modern PET CT camera. This is the PET image. Again, it's very similar to the one you saw before. That V-shaped thing up there is the patient's heart. That vertical white line is actually urine, radioactive urine, and that white spot at the bottom is the bladder. This is the corresponding anatomical slice, the CT image, and this is the fused image. And by combining the power of the molecular or physiological imaging of, for example, the PET image and an anatomical exquisite study like a CT image, we get the best of both worlds, and are now able to offer unprecedented things for patients in healthcare and managing their treatment and so on. But the key to understanding, I think, the role of PET is to understand the differences between what I'm going to call anatomical versus functional imaging of patients. Now, anatomical imaging you're quite familiar with. We image structural anatomy, and a CT scan represents that, chest x-rays, the ultrasounds, MRs, these sorts of things. An exquisite ability to do that. Whereas molecular imaging used to be called nuclear medicine imaging. Basically, we're imaging the function, whatever you want to call it, physiology or metabolism of the body. And we do that by introducing trace amounts, less than a billionth of a gram, of a radioactive substance, which goes to some tissue in the body, and the body then radiates this information out to the camera, in that case the PET camera, and from that it creates this image. But let's look at an example of anatomical versus functional or metabolic imaging, and this is in the case of a patient who has symptoms of dementia. And here's an X-ray or CT exam of the brain, and this is an exquisite picture of anatomy in the brain. The eyes are in that top left corner, those little round things with the white at the back. That's actually the patient's eyes. That funny H-shaped thing is the ventricles, or fluid spaces in the brain you hear about. But the bottom line is this: although this patient has lots of symptoms of dementia, this CT scan, the anatomy is absolutely normal. However, it is not uncommon where structure or anatomy can be normal, but function very much abnormal. And here is the strength of the functional imaging side, and this is what nuclear medicine is very good at, as imaging physiology, and this is the corresponding PET image, an FDG PET scan of this patient here, with a normal anatomical study, but a very abnormal PET scan which shows classic changes of dementia. And so by combining the power of these two and using them appropriately, we really have an amazing ability to do lots for patients. Now, most anatomical imaging modalities have exquisite ability to detect masses down to 1 millimeter or lower resolution. But what most people, including some physicians, don't understand is that something, CT, for example, has exquisite ability to say, yep, there's a mass there, shouldn't be there. But it has very limited ability to determine whether that mass is scar tissue, a benign tumor, or cancer. Obviously, it makes a major difference for the patient. In fact, one of the physicians, world experts I was taking my CT training from says, CT really is the view from 10,000 feet. By combining the CT with a functional imaging technique, in this case PET, but there are other things we do in nuclear medicine, we can now bring that 10,000 foot view down to a much more relevant personalized view for the patient or perspective. Now the world outside of Ontario, of course, has moved to generally using this functional or metabolic imaging to direct patient investigation and management where appropriate. And again, I say appropriate because what I want people to understand is that PET is not by any means perfect. It's like any other imaging modality. It's got great uses and it's got uses where it's not so good. It can have false positives where we think there's cancer there and it turns out not to be. I'm actually always happy when that happens because it means the patient, it doesn't have cancer. There are false negatives when the patient, actually has cancer and we don't see it, and so on. So again, it's like any test that has to be used properly. But in general, PET has become the cornerstone in the world, and functional imaging in general, of which it is the key example. They've moved to using that to direct investigation, whether that's a biopsy or whether it's another investigation such as the CT. Now to show you why that has happened, let's consider looking for the spread of cancer to bone before the functional imaging era, we'll say back in the 60s, when nuclear medicine really didn't exist. But did patients have spread of cancer to bone? And what physicians ordered was something called a skeletal survey, and that was multiple x-rays, I don't know how many it was, big dose of radiation to the patient from head to toes and fingertips, and even if cancer was present, it turns out that the chances of the x-rays picking it up early on was very limited. Then along came nuclear medicine, and in particular something called a bone scan. And what a bone scan does is we image metabolism of bone directly within the patient. And what we do is we inject, and I mean a trace amount of a radioactive substance into the body that goes to where bone is being metabolized. And when I say trace, I mean less than a billionth of a gram. Now, this is an image of a child of a bone scan, and these little black lines here, in fact, they're growth plates where bone turnover is very rapid. But what we really have is a map or an image of bone turnover. The blacker it is, the faster there's bone metabolism, and so that's an image of a bone scan. Now, a bone scan functional image can detect the spread of cancer to bone as much as 1.5 years before the x-rays would become abnormal. So nowadays what physicians do in the nuclear medicine functional imaging era is they order the bone scan first, and then they use that to direct the subsequent investigation, which in that case would be, for example, to order an x-ray, but just an x-ray of the area of concern. And so here we see a bone scan. This is an example of an abnormality in the sacroiliac joint on the right side. Now, bone scans are very sensitive. They're not always very specific, and so that could be other things, arthritis and so on. So what you then do is say, okay, well, let's just do one series of x-rays and look directly at that, and in fact the x-ray then confirms it. You know what, that actually is cancer of the bone. Rather than x-raying the whole body, as you can see. But currently the way the Ontario government is introducing PET is basically to have anatomical studies like CT and x-rays, direct physiological imaging like PET. Now this would be the equivalent of saying what we should do if we're looking for spread of cancer to bone is what we should do is go back to ordering the skeletal x-ray survey and use that to order the bone scan. I mean, this is not only absurd, but it clearly is bad medicine. Now, there are times when it's very clear that you need to do the CT and other things first. I mean, I'm not, again, trying to give the impression that there's no role for these other things, and that PET is always the answer. It isn't, but in Ontario, it just isn't an option in most cases. Now, one of the consequences of the approach Ontario is taking is that patients ultimately end up being exposed to far too much unnecessary radiation, particularly from CT scans. I have an example in my case scenario pages where patients have had as many as 8 CT scans in a row, trying to decide whether or not that's cancer, still not deciding it, and ultimately getting a PET scan to finally realize, oh, geez, we could have told you this was cancer or whatever 1.5 years ago, and so on. But this patient had the misfortune of living in Ontario.